Hey everybody. A couple of notes on the poets we're going to be reading for this unit, who are all three of them from very different standpoints, politically and otherwise, are writing during the English Civil War, right? The English Civil War is basically a conflict between um, Charles I and his Parliament. And conflicts between kings and Parliament are as old as kings and Parliament, right? But there are a number of factors that really sort of came together um, throughout James's reign and leading into Charles's reign, and these conflicts between the monarchy and Parliament boiled into a military conflict, right? And eventually led to the execution of Charles I, right? So this was a very, very bloody time um, to be an Englishman, to live in England, right? And the execution of Charles I leads to, the rule of the Rump Parliament for a time, and then eventually the setting up of the Protectorate by the army commander Oliver Cromwell, who ruled for 5 years. He dies. His son rules for a short period of time, and eventually, once he leaves office, Parliament takes back control. But then Charles II, who had been in exile in France, comes back and is restored to the monarchy in 1660. But this is a time of very, very revolutionary ideas, ideas about increasing the franchise, giving more people the vote, coming close to, but not exactly quite to democratic sovereignty, right? This is a time when the bourgeois class is sort of on the rise, right? It's a conflict between the nobility or the aristocracy and this rising class. It's a conflict between the king who wants to maintain economic control in the nation, right? And a parliament who is representing merchants, representing uh, wealthy middle class people who are representing property people, right? It's about religion as well, right? The presence of a Anglican church, right? And the sort of anti-clerical, puritanical party in Parliament and also in the army, right? Um, and these are the conflicts that eventually boil into what it becomes the Civil War, which ends with the regicide of Charles I, right? The trial and execution of the king, which is a very, very significant development, right? This is not something that happened before. Most kings are, the kings that we know who were killed, they either die in battle or they are forced to abdicate and then are murdered under, or they die under very suspicious circumstances. Not usually a trial and an execution, and then a rule by parliament. That's not usually. This is unprecedented in English history, right? And all three poets that you're going to be reading, in a way, address violence, right? And for example, Andrew Marvell writes a what appears to be what is called a Horatian Ode to Oliver Cromwell. What appears to be a celebratory poem about Oliver Cromwell and Oliver Cromwell's many multifaceted skills and his military might and his political prowess, and sort of celebrates him as an English hero, right? But what you have to understand about the ode as a poetic form, an ode is a single subject poem focused on one particular thing, like the Ode to the Nightingale, right? But there are two kinds. There's the Horatian ode, and then there's the Pindaric ode. Pindaric odes are unqualified praise, so just sort of like straightforward praise of a single subject. Horatian ode is corrective praise. So Marvell is levying sort of what appear to be very subtle critiques about Cromwell's militarism, about the way that Charles I was executed, right? So there's some things to think about when you're reading that political poetry, right? Whether or not they are sort of like straightforward praise or subtly critical, right? Um, and Catherine Phillips, who was a royalist, writes a very unambiguous sort of condemnation of the way that Charles was executed, right? On the double murder of Charles I, right? Sort of murdered by the people who betrayed him and also the friends that should have stood by him, right? So she is very unabashedly a royalist in that sense. Margaret Cavendish is also a royalist. Margaret Cavendish is sort of a trailblazer. She's very interested in science. She's very interested in atoms, right? There are a number of poems devoted to the subject of atoms, right? She sort of dabbles in Epicurean philosophy, this whole idea about atoms sort of bouncing into each other, and that's sort of how the world goes round, right? While maintaining the idea of an all-powerful God at the same time, right? She also lost a brother who was executed because of his support for the king, right? And she is very critical of violence, and you see that in The Hunting of the Hare, where she sort of criticizes the brutality of mankind, right? The so-called civilized people. And this is a poem that is sort of championed as like a poem that celebrates like vegetarian or vegan values. But I also think you have to read it in the from the perspective of somebody writing during a very bloody war, right? A time when philosophers like Thomas Hobbes were writing about the way in which people are, self-interested beings bent on sort of accumulation and sort of preserving themselves at all costs and naturally in conflict with one another. And that brings the necessity for sort of an all-powerful sovereign, right? Um, you know, there are very reactionary retrograde ideas, but there are also very radical political ideas going on at the same time. But this conflict eventually ends with the restoration of the monarchy many years later, which disappoints obviously a lot of people. We'll see that in Milton specifically, so I'll talk more about that then. Um, a couple of things. Another thing about Marvell, he is very close to Cromwell. He's very close to Milton. He's sort of close to the Puritan cause, but Marvell's politics are not very clear all the time. He manages to stay in good graces even through the Restoration, and he holds seats in Parliament. He writes what's called Carpe Diem poems, seize the day, and this is what you see in something like To His Coy Mistress. To His Coy Mistress, though, seems like a poem of seduction, something along the lines of what we saw in To His Mistress Going to Bed by John Donne. But Marvell is much more interested in the idea of like mortality and the idea of the passing of the time, right, and just sort of life on Earth. And he's less interested, I think, in the sexual aspect of it, right, in persuading the woman to sleep with him than he is in sort of thinking about time and the passage of time and mortality and these really grand sort of metaphors, right, about all these years would be devoted to describing your, the way that you look and things like that, your appearance, right? If we only had the time, had we but whirled enough in time, right? So it's more sort of about mortality. And he also is very critical of society in some of his poems. He's critical of the church, right? He's critical of the idea of Catholicism, right? Um, he's a bit of a naturist in the sense that he sort of sees nature as a positive alternative to society. And if you read those poems about nature, you sort of can understand how the Horatian Ode is a bit of a dig at Cromwell, right? Because you see the possibility that some of his championing of Cromwell as this great military leader and leader in society may be a bit tongue in cheek, right? Um, so those are some things to think about for poets writing during the time of the Revolution, how they're talking about, you know, political figures, how they're talking about political issues, how they address the issue of violence, which is a very sort of relevant issue at the time, right? How they are pushing boundaries, which this was a time for a lot of people, polemical writers at the time, to push boundaries with regards to politics and religion and things like that. Um, and how they navigate the political scene, right? How they sort of work within the confines of you know worrying about expressing their political ideas, right? And what the repercussions will be, right? But they also push the boundaries, I think, in a number of these poems, and how there is a sense, a skepticism about man being civilized, about society as being civilized, right? Like in the Mower poems and things like that, and also in Catherine Phillips's poem about Charles I. So that's just some background and some things to think about when you're reading. If you have questions, please feel free to ask and enjoy.